16 months ago, the LA Lakers won their first NBA title since 2010 and their first since signing LeBron James in free agency in the summer of 2018. It was the fulfillment of what seemed like an inevitable outcome. With James, one of the greatest players of all time, I'll leave the actual rankings up to you guys in the comments, joining forces with the most prestigious organization in the history of the league. It took just over 2 years for LeBron to bring the Lakers a title, a timeline pushed back a bit by a bizarre bubble situation. But here's the dirty little secret of the LeBron era in LA. Every other season has been a disaster. In the other 2+ seasons he's spent in LA, the team has a losing record overall, they have 1 playoff appearance, and 0 playoff series wins. A shocking lack of success for a player that had made the playoffs every year since 2005 prior to joining the Lakers, and had famously reached an incredible 8 consecutive NBA Finals before signing with the Lakers in 2018. Which brings up the question, did LeBron actually make a mistake by signing with the Lakers? My name is Tucker. Thank you for clicking on the video, by the way. I really appreciate it. Now, there are really 2 core aspects of this situation to take a look at. What has gone wrong with the LeBron Lakers era and where else he could have gone other than the Lakers back in 2018. A topic that I covered in depth back in 2018 in a video, and trust me, there are some really interesting situations he could have gone to. First though, let's talk about the current Lakers. And I could do the whole Russell Westbrook rant that I've done a couple of times, but I'm going to pass this time. What's really intriguing about LeBron signing with LA in the first place and how things have gone since and how things have gone wrong is that it never really went the way that it was supposed to initially. It was never supposed to just be LeBron going to the Lakers and then grabbing Anthony Davis later on. He was always supposed to have someone else joining him. The Lakers had the cap space available to sign him and someone else. They had these assets that they were going to potentially use and did ultimately use to trade for Anthony Davis down the road, but it was never supposed to be a 1-2 punch. There was always supposed to be 2 guys in free agency and then 1 via trade down the road. And when that didn't happen, that first LeBron year was really, really strange. Suddenly you had all these young players that had championship expectations, but they also wanted to be a primary part of the team so that they could get paid with their rookie contracts running out soon. LeBron ended up getting hurt and just nothing went according to plan in year 1. And ultimately they end up moving on from the coach. They trade a lot of the players, they get Anthony Davis, and then they go into the bubble and they win a title. And that is the biggest argument against this being a mistake for LeBron is yes, even though the other 2+ seasons, including this year, have been major downgrades in terms of the success of LeBron throughout his career, and the fact that obviously his upside is decreasing moving forward as he continues to age. You can't deny that winning that title in the bubble has already made this Lakers era a success. And that title was really impressive. It was under weird circumstances. Anthony Davis was awesome. LeBron was awesome. The role guys shot the ball really well. However, and I'm not a Mickey Mouse ring kind of guy. I hate that argument. I've been on record. I've made a video in the past before how I don't understand that argument. There are some circumstances though, of the bubble specifically, that really helped this Lakers team. When you think about the way they were constructed, pretty much primarily and only and solely around the talents of LeBron and Anthony Davis. LeBron, a player that was getting older and had injury issues in his time in LA, and Anthony Davis, who certainly has had injury issues in the past. The idea that they could show up for 2 to 2.5 months and go as hard as they possibly could for 2 to 2.5 months with the possibility of winning a title at the end of that path, that was an ideal circumstance for an older team and a team centered around 2 guys that both had injury issues in recent memory. Not that they didn't earn the title, they absolutely did, but had we never gone to a bubble, I think it's questionable whether the Lakers would have won that title if we just went throughout the rest of the season in a regular way. And if you follow that line of thinking and say that the Lakers never did win that title, that makes this era of LeBron basketball in LA a complete and utter disaster. And so in that parallel universe, you could certainly argue that LeBron going to LA in the first place was a mistake. And if that's the case, where else could he and potentially, arguably, should he have gone in 2018? Now, at the time, as I mentioned in that video back in 2018, I thought he was going to go to the Lakers, primarily because the basketball as well as the outside of basketball situations lined up pretty perfectly for him. He had the opportunity to team up with another big time player, whether that be Paul George was the biggest name out there at the time, or Kawhi Leonard down the road. Anthony Davis was certainly someone that we were keeping an eye on as a possible trade target for them. And the idea of being able to team up with 1 or 2 other really good players in LA was always the most intriguing basketball option, in addition to all the positive things outside of basketball that come from being a Laker. However, there were certainly some other options. We'll begin here by talking about a possible return to Cleveland. They had continued to make the finals despite a really, really weird roster. By the time LeBron did eventually leave, it's kind of a miracle that he dragged that group to the finals, but they did have some assets. They had the 8th pick in the draft coming up. They ended up using it on Colin Sexton. That was as a part of the Kyrie Irving trade. They had Kevin Love, who they could have possibly moved, even going back to before that season. There were possible trade options involving Kyrie or not that would have landed them players like Paul George. There were still options for LeBron in Cleveland, in addition to the loyalty he probably felt to that franchise. And the really fun thing to think about would be LeBron in this current Cavaliers nucleus, which is inarguably better than what the Lakers have around him right now with Evan Mobley, Jared Allen, Darius Garland. The problem, of course, being they wouldn't have gotten any of those guys if they still had LeBron on the team. But the point stands, it would have been fun. I didn't really view Cleveland as all that serious of a suitor for LeBron, though, in 2018, just because the basketball situation was not enviable compared to any of the other ones. Speaking of really fun basketball situations, the Houston Rockets were a very, very legitimate destination for LeBron going into the summer of 2018. There were times where we viewed them as the favorite, going to team up with CP3, who has a good relationship with, and James Harden, of course. That was a 60-plus win basketball team going into the summer of 2018, and it was a really exciting and an interesting thing to think about LeBron playing in all that space and playing alongside these other playmakers. But logistically, it was unlikely they were going to be able to make it work. It was way too difficult to figure out all the different salary stuff. Clint Capella was in a contract year. Chris Paul was in a contract year. It just wouldn't have been able to work without some kind of sign and trade scenario and breaking down the roster completely. Logistically, there was really no way to make it happen. But this next team is the one that by far intrigued me the most going into that summer for LeBron. And it was the Philadelphia 76ers. This is going back to before Jimmy Butler, before the Tobias Harris trade. This is like the JJ Redick, Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid, Marco Bellinelli, Dario Saric, Robert Covington version of Philadelphia. They had cap space. They could have just signed LeBron outright. There were multiple summers in which they had max cap space that they ultimately filled with guys like Jimmy Butler and guys like Tobias Harris. But LeBron in Philly was absolutely a legitimate possibility. Given how he would have fit alongside Simmons and Embiid, it would have been difficult to imagine an outstanding basketball fit there in terms of a lack of spacing, but from a talent perspective and logistically, how easy it would have been for them to bring him in, and the added benefit of staying in the East, which at the time was inarguably still the weaker conference, even with teams like Milwaukee and Boston on the rise. It would have been really cool if LeBron had ended up in Philadelphia, and basketball-wise, it was arguably even better than the Lakers, where he ended up going. Obviously, for Philly, that's not what ended up happening. They get Butler, they get Tobias Harris, they move Jimmy Butler for Josh Richardson, and now they end up where they are, where they've got Harden and Embiid. But LeBron alongside Simmons and Embiid would have been really fun. One other team I want to mention before we circle back to the Lakers is the LA Clippers. We're a little bit ahead on the timeline here before Paul George and Kawhi end up with the Clippers, but LeBron could have ended up in a very similar situation had he maybe opted back into another year with Cleveland and waited until 2019 if he chose to. I just don't think he ever would have gone there, because I don't think he would have been on the second team in LA, quite frankly. If LeBron was going to go to LA, it was going to be on the Lakers. He wasn't going to be on the Clippers and competing against the Lakers all the time. Kawhi and Paul George ended up doing that, and it's worked out fine for them, but that just doesn't line up at all with what LeBron typically does. Which brings us back now to the Lakers. I think ultimately, as the title references, it's possible that he made a mistake. It's hard to calculate how things would have gone in Philadelphia or Houston if they would have been able to make it work, or Cleveland. And had the title not happened, this would have been the worst 4-year era for LeBron ever, including going back to like his rookie season. The lack of success, not even making the playoffs, it would have been a complete and utter disaster, which isn't unheard of given his age, given some of the injury issues that he has dealt with. But ultimately, the bottom line here, the inarguable point, is the title. And it's just really difficult to say this player made a mistake by signing with this team when they end up winning a title with them. LeBron's 4th title, his 3rd different team that he had led to a championship. That's a really difficult point to argue around. And it's also a stretch to say that no matter where LeBron would have ended up, he would have had a ton of success. Quite frankly, he is getting older. And yeah, the Lakers haven't done a fantastic job of building around him. It would have been nice if someone like Paul George had come with him initially. And the Russell Westbrook trade has absolutely been a mistake, and they've made some roster mistakes. But there's no guarantee that those kinds of things wouldn't have happened elsewhere with the pressure bringing LeBron in to your situation. If he had gone to Philadelphia, would Ben Simmons have been traded earlier? Would Joel Embiid have been allowed to develop into the MVP caliber player that he is right now? There's just too many question marks to say definitively that any one of the other situations I mentioned in this video would have been a massive upgrade over LA. So did LeBron make a mistake by signing with the Lakers in 2018? I'm going to say no.